The wind off the high desert carried a bitter chill, the kind that scraped across the plains and bit deep into bone. Winter had settled hard over Red Creek, a lonely settlement clinging to the edge of the Arizona Territory in 1872. The people there were hardy folk, miners, traders, soldiers' widows, and the few who had nowhere else to go. Among them was Eleanor Hayes, a woman of quiet resolve and striking beauty, though the years had carved a gentle sorrow behind her gray eyes. Eleanor's husband, Thomas, had been killed 3 winters ago, caught in a raid while escorting a wagon of goods across Apache lands. The army had brought her his body wrapped in canvas, and the note that said "killed in service." She'd buried him herself behind the trading post they'd built together, marking the grave with a rough-hewn cross and a small cluster of wild sage that she replanted every spring. Since then, she'd run the post alone, selling grain, cloth, gunpowder, and tobacco to trappers, drifters, and soldiers who rode through Red Creek. The nights were long, the silence heavy. The only company she kept was her old dog and the fire that crackled low in the hearth. Her hands were never idle, always mending, grinding coffee, tallying accounts, but her heart had gone still, as if it, too, had been buried with Thomas under the red earth. That day, the wind carried something new, a sound unlike the endless groan of winter. Horses, the jangle of reins. A group of riders emerged through the whirling dust, 4 men wrapped in rawhide and furs, their mounts thin but strong. They were traders from the San Carlos Plains, their faces marked by the long sun of the southern lands. Behind them rode another man, taller, quieter, and apart from the others. He wore no hat, only a band of woven leather across his brow, his hair long and black, braided loosely down his back. His skin was copper brown, his eyes dark and steady. His name, she later learned, was Taza, an Apache warrior turned trader, a man who walked between 2 worlds but belonged to neither. The townsfolk watched him warily as the riders approached the post. Many still bore the wounds of the frontier wars, homes burned, sons lost. But Taza carried himself with calm strength, neither hostile nor submissive. When he dismounted, the snow crunched beneath his moccasins, and he tied his horse to the rail outside Eleanor's shop. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She had seen Apache before, sometimes on peaceful trade, sometimes not. But there was something different about this one. He moved with a grace that felt both dangerous and sorrowful, as though he carried ghosts at his side. "Trade," he said softly, his English rough but clear. She nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the firelight warmed the room, glinting off jars of preserves and bolts of fabric. He laid out what he carried: pelts of fox, wolf, and beaver, beautifully cleaned and bound in leather. "They're fine," Eleanor said, examining the fur with a practiced eye. "I can offer sugar, flour, or coffee, maybe some lead or shot." Taza's dark eyes met hers. "Coffee," he said, "and salt." As she weighed out the goods, she could feel his gaze lingering, not rudely but with quiet curiosity. It unsettled her in a way she hadn't felt in years. When the trade was done, he pulled from his bundle a smaller pelt, soft, silver gray, gleaming even in the dim light. He placed it gently on the counter. "Gift," he said simply. Eleanor frowned. "I can't take a gift from a trader." He looked at her then, really looked, his expression unreadable. "Not trader," he said, tapping his chest. "Man." And before she could reply, he turned and left, the bell above the door ringing softly behind him. That night, Eleanor sat by the fire, the silver pelt across her lap. The furs shimmered under the flames, softer than anything she'd ever touched. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, and the snow began to fall heavy again. For the first time in months, she dreamed, not of her husband nor of the empty prairie, but of dark eyes and a low, quiet voice saying words she could not understand. Days passed. The storm deepened. Trade slowed to nothing, and Red Creek seemed to vanish beneath the snow. Then one afternoon, Eleanor heard a knock on her door, a rare sound in such weather. She opened it to find Taza standing there, snow caked on his shoulders, his horse nowhere in sight. He was half frozen, his breath coming in ragged clouds. "Storm took my trail," he said simply. "I ask shelter." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Inside, he thawed by the fire, his hands trembling as he held them to the heat. She gave him broth and whiskey, and he thanked her with a small nod. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "My people say wind spirits test the strong," he said. "If you live through storm, you earn another sunrise." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then I suppose we both earn tomorrow." They sat in silence for a time, listening to the fire crack and the wind tear at the shutters. Outside, the world was white and merciless. Inside, it was warm, still, and somehow sacred. Taza studied the shelves, the tin pots, the flour sacks, the rifles hanging above the hearth. "You live alone," he said finally. "I do," she replied. "Since my husband died." He bowed his head slightly. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words carried more truth than all the polite condolences she'd ever heard. When she met his eyes again, she found something there, something she couldn't name. Not pity, not desire. Something older, quieter, deeper. It stirred in her like the first green shoot under snow. Later, when he slept by the fire wrapped in a blanket, Eleanor sat awake, watching the flames dance over his face. His features were strong but not hard. His hands, though scarred, were gentle. She thought of what the soldiers had said years ago, that the Apache were savages, untamable, heartless. But there was nothing savage in this man. Only the calm of the desert and the endurance of stone. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she wondered if life might still hold something more than memory and grief. When dawn broke, the storm had passed. The world outside lay clean and white beneath the rising sun. Taza saddled his horse, ready to ride. Eleanor handed him a small sack of food for his journey. "For the trail," she said. He accepted it but didn't move right away. His gaze lingered on her face, tracing the softness there that hadn't been there before. "You helped me," he said quietly, "when the cold wanted my life." "I did what anyone would," she replied, though she knew it wasn't true. Few in Red Creek would have opened their door to an Apache in a snowstorm. He took a deep breath, as if weighing words he rarely spoke. Then, with a faint smile that curved like sunlight over stone, he said, "I'd trade 10 furs for one night with you." Eleanor froze, the words cutting through the morning air like a blade wrapped in velvet. He spoke not with lust, but with a kind of reverence, like a prayer whispered to the dawn. Before she could answer, he mounted his horse and turned toward the open plains. She stood there long after he'd vanished, the silver pelt still draped over her arm, the warmth of his voice echoing in her chest. And deep inside her, something long buried began to stir again, the first trembling spark of a fire not yet lit. The days that followed were restless ones for Eleanor Hayes. She went about her work at the trading post, sweeping the floors, tallying her ledger, restocking the shelves, but her mind was far from the walls of her shop. It lingered on the memory of Taza, the Apache warrior who had appeared in her doorway like a phantom from the storm. She tried to forget him, to tuck away his voice, his dark, steady eyes, the strange warmth that had kindled inside her when he'd said those words. But she couldn't. They haunted her more than her own loneliness ever had. "I'd trade 10 furs for one night with you." It hadn't been a bargain, it had been something else, something truer. The way he said it, soft and solemn, had made her heart ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. The winter deepened. January came hard upon Red Creek, freezing wells solid and locking wagons in ice. The soldiers at the nearby fort sent word of more Apache raids across the San Pedro Valley. They told the townsfolk to keep watch, to bar their doors. The tension in the air thickened like smoke before a fire. Eleanor listened, but she didn't believe all of it. She'd looked into Taza's eyes. Those were not the eyes of a killer. But she kept her shutters latched at night and her rifle near the bed. One evening, the sky went black without warning. A blizzard rolled in from the north, wild and merciless. The wind screamed through the eaves, rattling the windows like bones. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like the air itself turned to glass. Eleanor hurried to bar the door and feed the stove. But before she could latch the shutters tight, a heavy knock pounded against the door. Once, twice, 3 times, her heart leapt. No one sane would be out in that storm. Cautiously, she unbolted the door, and there he was. Taza stood on her porch, snow crusted in his hair, his coat soaked through, his horse nowhere in sight. His lips were blue, his eyes half closed from exhaustion. "I ask shelter," he said, voice hoarse against the wind. Without a word, Eleanor grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing out the storm. She set him by the fire, stripped off his soaked coat, and wrapped him in blankets. He was shaking violently from the cold, his breath shallow. Eleanor poured whiskey into a tin cup and pressed it to his lips. "Drink," she ordered. He obeyed, wincing as the heat burned down his throat. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind howled outside, battering the shutters like a living thing. Inside, the only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the slow, ragged rhythm of their breathing. After some time, color began to return to his face. He looked around the cabin, the shelves, the table, the single chair by the fire. His gaze finally rested on her. "You live alone," he said softly, repeating what he'd asked once before. "I do." He nodded slowly. "Alone is a hard thing," she gave a faint smile. "You'd know, wouldn't you?" "I know." Hours passed. She fed him stew, mended his torn sleeve, and let him rest by the fire. When she spoke, he listened. When he spoke, she found herself leaning closer, drawn to the low timbre of his voice. He told her of the mountains where he was born, the land of red canyons and wind-swept mesas, where his people once hunted freely. But now he said the soldiers took the rivers and the game. The land grew smaller, the hunger greater. "I left my people to keep peace," he said, "to trade, to bring food. But still they call me traitor. White men call me savage, so I walk alone." There was no bitterness in his tone, only weariness, the kind that runs deep as a scar. Eleanor listened, her heart twisting. She saw in him something she recognized: loss. The same kind she'd felt when she buried her husband. When she'd faced that long first winter alone. They were two souls carved by grief, shaped by solitude, meeting in the middle of a storm neither had asked for. That night, as the storm screamed around them, they spoke of many things, of the stars, the desert, the way the world could be cruel yet strangely beautiful. Eleanor poured them each a small glass of whiskey. The fire burned low, casting warm amber light on their faces. At one point, their hands brushed on the table. The touch was fleeting, but it carried the weight of something unspoken. Eleanor pulled away first, her breath catching in her throat. "Why do you look at me like that?" she asked. Taza's dark eyes held hers. "Because you're alive," he said simply. "Even when your heart has tried to stop." Her lips parted, but no words came. The wind shrieked outside, and for a moment, it felt like the world beyond her walls had vanished, leaving only this, two people bound by the small flickering flame between them. Then, in a voice rough as gravel yet soft as prayer, he whispered, "I'd trade 10 furs for one night with you." The same words as before, but now they meant more. They carried warmth, longing, and a quiet reverence that felt sacred. Eleanor turned away, her heart pounding. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why?" "Because I might believe you." He smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming like embers in the dark. "Then believe." The storm raged for 3 days. During that time, Taza stayed in her cabin, helping with chores, chopping wood, mending the roof that groaned under the snow. He was strong and graceful, moving with quiet purpose. The dog, who trusted no one but Eleanor, took to him immediately. They fell into a rhythm, silent but warm. When he laughed, it startled her, low and rich like thunder rolling far away. At night, they sat close by the fire, speaking little. The air between them grew thick with what neither dared name. On the third night, Eleanor woke to find him standing by the window, watching the snow drift silver under the moonlight. "You should sleep," she said softly. "I dream too much," he replied. "Dreams can lie." She stepped closer. "And what do they tell you?" "That I'll never see this again," he said, turning to her. "This peace, this warmth, you," her breath caught. The distance between them vanished, only the faint glow of the fire separating their shadows. But just as he reached for her hand, a sharp knock shattered the silence. They froze, another knock, louder. Eleanor moved to the door, rifle in hand. When she opened it, the storm wind blew in the faces of 2 soldiers from Fort Stanton. Their uniforms were crusted with snow, their expressions cold. "Evening, ma'am," one said, tipping his hat. "We're looking for an Apache, one of the hostiles. Tall fella, scar on his left cheek. You seen anyone fit that description?" Eleanor's pulse thundered. She glanced toward the hearth. Taza had vanished into the shadows behind the storeroom. She swallowed. "No, haven't seen anyone but the wind in 3 days." The soldiers looked around suspiciously, then nodded. "You watch yourself, ma'am. These savages have been raiding all along the Santa Cruz. Dangerous times. When they left, Eleanor closed the door and locked it tight. Taza stepped out slowly, his face calm, but his eyes dark with something like sorrow. "I bring danger to your door," he said. "I should go." Eleanor shook her head. "You'll freeze out there. Better that than bring death here." She took a step toward him. "You saved my life once already, Taza. I'll not let you throw yours away." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something fierce and fragile all at once. The storm still howled, the fire still burned, and in that small cabin on the edge of the frozen frontier, the line between duty and desire blurred like smoke. When the blizzard finally broke, the valley of Red Creek lay quiet beneath a sky so clear it seemed cut from glass. The snow glimmered under the morning sun, soft as down and deep as sorrow. Eleanor stood at her door, watching the horizon as the last gusts of the storm whispered away. Behind her, Taza saddled his horse in silence. The time had come for him to leave, and though neither spoke it aloud, both knew this parting would not be an easy one. "You should stay until the roads thaw," she said. Clutching her shawl tighter against the cold, Taza looked up, his expression unreadable. "If soldiers find me here, they will not ask why." Eleanor swallowed hard. He was right. The men from the fort came through Red Creek every few weeks, suspicious and restless. They saw Apaches not as men, but as prey. If they found him here, no words would save him or her. She tried to smile. "Then you'd better ride fast." He gave a small nod. "And far." But before he mounted, he stepped close, his hand reaching up to brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm, careful, reverent. "You have brave eyes," he said softly, "the kind that see what others fear." Her heart stuttered in her chest. "And what do they see in you?" He held her gaze. "A man who should have died long ago but didn't." Then, without another word, he swung into the saddle and rode into the pale morning, leaving only a trail of hoofprints that the wind soon erased. Eleanor watched until he vanished over the ridge. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. The weeks that followed were both quiet and restless. Red Creek thawed slowly beneath the lengthening days. The river cracked free of ice and wagons began rolling again. But for Eleanor, the world felt hollow. She'd gotten used to Taza's quiet presence, the rhythm of his movements, the low calm of his voice, the strange, unexpected comfort that had filled her small cabin. Without him, the night seemed emptier than before. She busied herself with work, but the memory of his words lingered. "I'd trade 10 furs for one night with you." It had sounded like a promise then, a longing bound by respect, not possession. And though he'd gone, she carried it like a secret beneath her ribs. Still, whispers began to stir in town. 2 weeks after the storm, a rider arrived from Fort Stanton, a man dressed in dark leather, carrying himself with the cold confidence of a bounty hunter. His name was Silas Crane, and he came asking questions. "Ma'am," he said one afternoon, stepping into her trading post. His voice was smooth, his smile practiced. "Name's Crane. Looking for an Apache by the name of Taza. Tall fella, scar on his left cheek. You wouldn't have seen him come through here, would you?" Eleanor kept her hands steady on the counter. "No," she said flatly. "Can't say I have." Crane's smile widened just enough to make her skin crawl. "You sure? Folks say a man like him's been sighted in these parts. Trapper, trader, maybe a thief." "He's no thief," she said before she could stop herself. Crane's eyes sharpened. "So you have seen him?" Eleanor's pulse jumped. "I've heard the name, that's all." He studied her for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "Well, if you do see him, ma'am, best let the fort know. There's a price on his head, dead or alive." When he left, the room felt colder. Eleanor leaned against the counter, her heart pounding. She realized then that whatever peace they'd shared had been fragile, a candle burning in the wind. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement near the tree line. A horse, a figure, her heart leapt. She slipped on her cloak, grabbed her rifle, and stepped outside. "Taza?" she whispered into the darkness. From the shadows he emerged, leading his horse, his face drawn and weary. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw relief and pain. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, voice trembling between fear and longing. "They hunt me," he replied. "I couldn't stay away." "Not from you," she stepped closer. "The soldiers, and I know. I saw them on the trail. But I needed to tell you the truth before they do." Her breath caught. "What truth?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Your husband. Thomas Hayes, the night he died, I was there. Her world tilted. What? I was part of the band that found his wagon. I wasn't the one who killed him, I tried to stop it. He fought bravely. I dragged him from the fire. He was already dying when I reached him. His last words? He said your name. The rifle slipped from her hands, falling into the snow with a dull thud. Why are you telling me this? She whispered, tears freezing on her lashes. Because you deserve truth, Taza said. Because I cannot carry this lie between us. Eleanor turned away, the world spinning. The man she'd come to trust, the man she'd begun to love, had been there the night her husband died. The thought tore through her like a blade. Go, she said hoarsely. Go before I can't stop myself from calling the fort. He flinched but didn't move. Eleanor, please, she said, voice breaking. Just go. For a long moment, neither spoke. The snow fell between them like silent ash. Finally, Taza reached into his satchel and pulled out something wrapped in leather. He placed it on the ground before her, a white fox pelt, the same kind he'd given her weeks before. For your hands, he said softly, so they stay warm. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. Eleanor stood there long after he was gone, the pelt clutched in her hands. The fire in her chest, love, grief, rage, burned all at once. By dawn, she made her decision. She rode into town, her face pale and set. She went straight to the saloon where Silas Crane was sitting by the stove. I know where he's headed, she said, her voice flat. South, toward the canyon. Crane's eyes gleamed. You sure about that, ma'am? Positive. He nodded, grabbing his rifle and hat. Much obliged. I'll make sure he don't trouble you again. As he rode out, Eleanor stood in the doorway, her stomach twisting. She told herself she'd done what she had to, what was right. But when the sun set that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd sent death after the only man who'd ever truly seen her. That night, the wind returned, moaning through the valley like a restless spirit. Eleanor sat by the fire, staring at the pelt Taza had left behind. It shimmered in the light, soft and pure, untouched by blood or guilt. She thought of his eyes, his voice, the truth he'd carried into her home at risk of his life. She thought of the look on his face when she'd told him to leave. And when the first snowflake drifted against her window, she whispered his name into the silence. Taza. But only the wind answered back. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a soft golden warmth that rolled over the hills of Red Creek. The snow melted from the ridges, the river sang again, and the valley bloomed in wildflowers. The long, cruel winter had passed, both the one on the land and the one in Eleanor Hayes's heart. Her days no longer felt heavy. She rose each morning to sunlight pouring through the window, the smell of coffee and wood smoke filling her small cabin. She no longer moved through life like a ghost tethered to sorrow. She laughed again, softly at first, then freely. The reason was simple and alive. Taza. After the raid, he had stayed in Red Creek, first as a wounded guest, then as a quiet fixture of the town. The settlers who once crossed the street to avoid him now nodded in respect when he passed. He helped rebuild burned fences, hunted game for widows, and carved toys for the children who stared at him in wonder. He never asked for thanks, never stayed for praise. He did it because the land had given him back his life, and so had she. Eleanor found herself watching him often, the way he moved with quiet strength, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. When he smiled, rare and shy, it was like the sun breaking through after a storm. But even peace has its shadows. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the hills, Captain Drummond from Fort Stanton rode into town. He came with orders and a letter sealed with the U.S. Army's insignia. Taza stood beside Eleanor on the porch of her trading post as the captain dismounted. Mrs. Hayes, Drummond said curtly, then turned to Taza. You're to come with me. Word from Santa Fe. Washington's calling all Apache on the government's list to the reservation. The words struck like a stone to the chest. Eleanor's hand found Taza's arm. He's not a prisoner, she said, her voice sharp. He's no threat to anyone. Drummond's eyes narrowed. Maybe not. But orders are orders. His name's marked in the records. He can come peacefully or not at all. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the faint scent of spring sage. Then Taza spoke, his voice low and calm. If I go, I don't return. Eleanor's throat tightened. Then don't go. He looked at her with that steady gaze. the one that had first unsettled her, the one that now steadied her own soul. If I run, they burn this town to the ground. I won't bring war to your door. Her hand trembled as she gripped his sleeve. There must be another way. Drummond looked away, uncomfortable. He saved this town. That's worth something. Maybe I can delay the orders a few days. He mounted up again. You've got until Sunday. After that, he rides with me. When the captain left, silence hung heavy between them. The sun sank behind the ridge, painting the sky in fire. Eleanor turned to Taza, her eyes glistening. You won't let them take you. He reached out and cupped her face in his hand. If I go, it's to keep peace. Not because I'm theirs. She shook her head, tears spilling. I can't lose you again, Taza. He smiled faintly, a warmth behind the pain. You never lost me, White Dove. Even when I was far away, my heart stayed here. That night, sleep would not come. The fire burned low, and Eleanor sat watching the embers fade, every thought tangled in fear. Taza sat across from her, sharpening his knife, his movements calm but distant. He'd seen enough of the world to know what the reservation meant, barbed wire, rations, and slow death. Finally, she spoke. There's a place north past the ridge, Old Pine Canyon. No one goes there since the mines closed. You could hide there until they forget. He looked up, his eyes soft. They never forget. Then we'll go farther. To New Mexico, to the mountains, anywhere but here. For the first time, he let the knife fall from his hand. You'd leave all this? She rose, her voice trembling. I'd leave everything if it meant you'd live. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he stood, stepping close, his shadow mingling with hers in the firelight. You would trade your home, your name, your safety, for one like me? Eleanor's hand came up to rest against his chest. You once said you'd trade 10 furs for one night with me. I'd trade 10 years of peace for one lifetime beside you. The silence that followed was deep and sacred. Then he drew her close and they kissed. Not the hesitant touch of before, but a promise fierce and certain. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The storm in her heart was gone. By dawn, they were gone. Red Creek woke to find the widow's trading post shuttered and her shelves emptied. Some said she'd gone east to her sister. Others whispered that she'd run off with the Apache she'd nursed to health. The sheriff didn't say a word. He simply looked toward the northern ridge and smiled faintly. For weeks, the fort sent riders to search. They found nothing but empty hills, deer tracks, and old campfires. It was as if the desert itself had swallowed them whole. Far from town, nestled in a quiet valley between towering pines, Eleanor and Taza built a small cabin by a silver lake. The air was cool and clean, and wildflowers grew along the water's edge. They lived simply, fishing, hunting, planting small crops of corn and beans. Sometimes, when the wind carried the scent of pine and rain, Eleanor would remember the store, the town, the life she'd left behind. But she never once regretted it. Taza taught her the songs of his people, how to read the stars, how to walk softly through the forest. In turn, she taught him to write his name and brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead. At night, they lay side by side under the open sky, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. On the first anniversary of their flight, Taza disappeared into the forest before dawn. Eleanor woke to an empty bed and the sound of birds in the trees. For hours she waited, her heart thudding with both worry and wonder. Then, as the sun began to sink, he returned. He carried something draped over his arm, a fur shawl, soft and shining, stitched with beads and lined with silver fox for you, he said simply. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her eyes filling with tears. It's beautiful. He smiled, that rare, slow smile that still melted her heart. I'd still trade 10 furs for one night with you, he said. Eleanor laughed softly, shaking her head. Foolish man. You already have every night. He looked out toward the mountains, the setting sun glinting in his eyes. And I'll still keep trading, so long as the nights keep coming. The years that followed passed quietly. The world beyond the hills changed, railroads, telegraphs, new laws, but their life remained untouched. Sometimes, travelers passing through Old Pine Canyon spoke of smoke rising from a hidden valley, or a woman's laughter echoing through the pines. Some swore they saw a tall Apache and a fair-haired woman riding side by side along the ridge at dusk. The people of Red Creek called it a ghost tale, but those who believed said it wasn't ghosts at all. Just two souls who had found peace beyond the reach of both the frontier and fate. One evening, as the sun sank behind the pines and the lake shimmered gold, Eleanor sat beside Taza on the porch. The air smelled of rain and wild sage. "Do you ever miss the world we left behind?" she asked softly. He looked out at the horizon. "The world never gave me peace. This," he said, taking her hand, "is peace." She smiled, her heart full. "Then promise me one thing." He turned to her, eyes warm and deep. "Anything. Promise that no matter what comes, no matter how many winters pass, you'll still whisper those words to me." He smiled. "I will whisper them until the wind carries my last breath." And as twilight wrapped the mountains in soft blue light, he leaned close, his voice barely a murmur against her ear. "I'd trade 10 furs for one night with you." She closed her eyes, leaning into him, the sound of his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. The wilderness had taken much from them both, but it had given them the one thing the world had always denied: love that endured like the mountains themselves.